preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Hello, everyone. I was going to say hello, ladies and gentlemen, but someone pointed out there are no men in the audience. So hello, ladies. Welcome to the third event in the About Women lecture series. Tonight we have Dr. Valerie Steele, who will be talking to us about the clothing that men and women wear for work, and how it is affected in large part by our interpretations of gender stereotypes. Sorry. And how jewelry sometimes gets in the way. Now, Dr. Steele is well qualified to talk about this. She is currently a graduate professor at the Fashion Institute of Technology here in the city. She's the author of 2 books on fashion, one Paris Fashion and the other Fashion and Eroticism. And she just recently co-edited a Smithsonian publication entitled Men and Women Dressing the Part, which is, all 3 of the books are wonderful. And actually, you can order 2 of them from out front if you're interested. That's all I have to say. Valerie, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Could we get the lights off and we'll look at the first slide? Dress for success is not a new idea. As early as 1907, the Ladies' Home Journal was printing an article on how business women should and should not dress. And the advice that they offered sounds very much like the kind of advice that we still read today. So, for example, it advised women not to wear provocative or overly feminine clothes to the office. They said, quote, "A woman of sense doesn't go to her office desk in a peekaboo blouse and a trailing velveteen skirt. The girl with too much feminine finery gives the unfortunate impression of being more interested in men and ice cream than in a day's work." However, they also advised that although you should model your clothes on men's work clothes, you shouldn't model them too closely. As they put it, it was equally reprehensible to be one of those misguided people who have gone severity mad, making themselves ridiculously masculine. A woman like that, concluded the anonymous author, is only a feeble imitation of a man. Now, if we look at this picture, we can see that the male is wearing a typical business suit, rather unchanged from the early 20th century to the present day. The woman, who's clearly the subordinate, is wearing a kind of nice, genteel women's clothing suitable both for co-eds at college and young business women, and women who didn't work but who wanted to look serious. Notice also that she's wearing kind of a little bow tie. This came in very early, towards the later part of the 19th century. Even though it was not a functional element in male dress, it was one of the first things that women picked up on, along with a kind of button-down shirt, and also, although we don't see it here, a suit. Because women who started to wear suits already by the 1860s and 70s, and by the 80s they were very common, not just for working women, but again for women who wanted to look a bit businesslike if they went out walking or traveling. This was something that Americans led with. Women were wearing suits long before the French really got into it. In the early 20th century, French writers were still saying that suits were a really masculine article of clothing, and it amounted to a kind of revolution that women were wearing suits. Now, historically, men and women have tended to perform rather different jobs. We need only think of the stereotypes that existed as recently as 10 years ago. The doctor's a man, the nurse is a woman. The policeman, fireman, and businessman are all men, while the secretary is always a woman. Until recently, many people assumed that there were natural reasons why men or women took particular jobs. So, for example, men are intelligent, so they make good doctors. Men are brave, so they make good policemen. Women are kind, so they make good nurses. Women love children, so they make good teachers, etc. Yet historically, there have been many jobs that changed sex. So, for example, during the 19th century, the male clerk was largely replaced by the female secretary. And when women first tried to get into the office in the middle of the 19th century, their male colleagues objected that they were mentally, morally, and physically incapable of doing office work. Well, by the end of the 19th century, 75% of office workers were women. And now people argue that with that feminine dexterity, they were particularly good at the kind of small details that secretaries were now supposed to do. So again, natural reasons were thought of why women now could be and should be secretaries. Also, we find female midwives being replaced by male obstetricians. And of course, the medical schools tended to be very difficult for women to get into. So wherever jobs changed sex like this, the changes usually occurred in response to changing labor market conditions and technology. But people always came up with reasons why the new situation was natural and sex-linked. Now, the clothes that were worn for various jobs have also been designed and perceived through the lens of sexual stereotypes. Most people assume that work clothes are designed to be practical for the job at hand. But with a very few exceptions, this is not primarily the case. Certain kinds of firefighting equipment, for example, have been thought out to make it safer for firemen to go in a burning building. But even there's still elements of symbolic dress. And with most jobs, it's clear that people could perform the job at hand wearing a variety of different kinds of clothing. So that if a particular kind of clothing becomes conventional for a job, then this is usually due more to its symbolic value than to purely practical considerations. And one of the elements of symbolism expressed in clothing are gender concerns. Now, in this talk, I hope to explore some of the ways in which gender affects both the work we do and the clothes we wear to work. And the main examples of work clothing that I'm going to talk about are police uniforms, the uniforms of doctors and nurses, briefly touching on the clothing of factory workers, and then talking about standard business attire. So we look at this slide here, a cover from Psychology Today, 1974. Inside is an article which indicates that we're more likely to obey a person wearing a uniform, or at least certain people in certain uniforms. Historically, men have tended to be far more likely to wear the uniforms of hierarchical authority or professional status, the kind of uniforms that we obey, whereas women have been more likely to wear the uniforms of subordinates, in other words, waitresses rather than generals, this type of thing. The police uniform, however, was initially attacked by policemen and described as the livery of lackeys. So in 1844, for example, the New York City police argued that uniforms conflicted with their notions of independence and self-respect, and they even demonstrated rather violently in front of the police chief's house to indicate that they had no intention of wearing these uniforms. They were still, again, ordered to wear them. They refused. They said it would make them look like footmen. It took about another decade and a half before they were forced into their uniforms, and at this point, public opinion and police opinion had started to change. So according to one newspaper article of the 1850s, all persons legally endowed with authority should be uniformed, so as to carry with them, even to the casual passerby, the sign of their authority, and then no one would pretend to dispute it. As another police historian wrote in 1885, the uniform gave a trim and soldierly appearance, and he emphasized that this affected both the psyche of the policemen themselves and the attitudes of the public when they saw the policeman in uniform. These new regulation uniforms, while they varied, tended to imitate military uniforms, tended to be navy blue cloth with, say, a black silk velvet collar and rows of buttons, which varied according to rank, as well as other insignia such as the captain's silver star, the sergeant's copper star, which is probably where the term cop comes from, etc. So notice the themes that are being emphasized: authority, organization, hierarchy, and a certain trim and military look. These are all very important features of dominant hierarchical authority uniforms. But when women started to enter the police force, not only were their uniforms different from men's, to the extent that they wore uniforms at all at the beginning, so also was the character of their work. When they first came in, popular illustrations sometimes showed policewomen collaring criminals, but in fact their jobs more closely resembled social work. And they focused specifically on the care of women and children. So protecting the innocent and helpless was their mandate. In 1912, when a law was passed in Maryland providing for policewomen in Baltimore, horrified legislators had to be reassured that the women would not be uniformed and they would not have beats because the senators had terrible, quote, visions of women in uniforms and brass buttons parading the streets, arresting drunken men. Nothing of the sort was allowed to go on for some time. New York City policewomen did begin carrying revolvers in 1934, which is more than 40 years after they first began to come into the police force. But the policewoman carried her gun in a purse, not in a holster. The purse was a leather over-the-shoulder bag with one compartment for her .32 and another for her cosmetics. The cosmetics were apparently not issued by the police department itself, but there was the expectation that she would want and need them. An article for Good Housekeeping in 1941 reported that policewomen in Washington, D.C. also carried revolvers, but seldom had to use them because their duties still focused on women and children, from fingerprinting women prisoners to investigating complaints about cruelty to children. The Washington, D.C. policewoman at this time was dressed in simple, tailored clothes, and her badge might be clipped under a lapel, or it might simply be carried in her purse. So they seem to be carrying a lot of stuff in these purses. The policewoman's uniform did evolve over time, but it retained the skirt. The hem rose from the ankle in the 1890s to a modest mini in the 1960s. A New York City police photograph from about 1965 in the collection downtown showed policewomen in their newly updated everyday uniforms, complete with pocketbooks, ladylike white gloves, a little cap that needed to be pinned on, and moderately high heels. According to one recent historian, police departments introduced a cute little stewardess-type hat, end quote, in a deliberate attempt to feminize the policewoman's uniform. It was really only in 1972 when Congress amended Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act that police departments around the country systematically started to integrate policewomen into the force as a whole and to assign policewomen to do the same patrol work as men. In 1973, I don't know, that wasn't me. In 1973, skirts were finally replaced by trousers. Of course, as you may recall, it was only in the 1970s that trousers started to be acceptable for a variety of kinds of office work. And now for the first time, the same duties and the same clothes were assigned to both male and female police officers. Now, before we leave this picture of the old-style woman's police uniform, I want to give you a quote from a woman, Helene Cassell, who's now a captain in the Fairfax County Police Department in Virginia. And she recently recalled how the policewoman's uniform had changed during her lifetime. She said, quote, "When I first came on, they issued skirts. A patrol officer carries a 4-inch revolver. At that time, they issued the women 2-inch revolvers. They gave women a purse to carry with a holster built into the purse versus wearing a gun and a regular holster around your waist. It really wasn't practical. Have you ever tried to get a gun or handcuffs out of a purse? It's just not practical, especially if you need to get them out quickly. Of course, a skirt is not practical as far as actually going out into a patrol area and enforcing the law. You can't climb a ladder very easily or anything else. I guess they just didn't know how women should dress when they first came in. Basically, our uniform has been transformed into almost the same thing the men are wearing, mainly because it's functional and the other really wasn't practical at all," end quote. Now, it seems to me that she's being almost too charitable. Was it just that the top brass didn't know how women should dress? Women in police work at that time were restricted by much more than their dress. Again, both the uniforms and their duties were supposed to be appropriately feminine. If we look at the symbolism of the police uniform, and in particular, its recognizable resemblance to military uniforms, then it's reasonable to conclude that the feminized uniforms that police women wore for so many decades indicated a certain ambivalence about the women's role as an authority figure. So, for example, you're mixing symbols of authority like a gun and a badge with symbols of femininity and gentility like a purse and white gloves, etc. Now, the military uniform has also been the prototype for other uniforms traditionally associated with masculine jobs. And uniform manufacturers favor two basic styles of guard and guard type uniform. On the one hand, the law enforcement knockoff, and then on the other hand, the soft look uniform, which could be a blazer and slacks, for a growing number of clients who prefer to have their security low-key. Now, a recent attempt to have security guards wear commando-style guard uniforms, khaki-colored and worn with military berets, has not been successful. It really backfired because they found that, as Pinkerton's director points out, we would very much avoid a uniform that would convey combativeness because people started becoming aggressive towards these guards. On the other hand, Eastern Airlines found that they decided to retain their new uniforms for flight attendants, despite fears that the uniforms looked too military. The deciding factor was the argument that, quote, in-flight assaults on attendants had dropped markedly after the uniform was introduced, apparently because passengers took the military style as more than just appearance. So we have an interesting situation here. Predominantly female flight attendants benefited from looking tough, while predominantly male security guards in commando uniforms simply attracted more flack. Whether or not we like it, sexual stereotypes may affect how particular uniforms work. Meanwhile, in an experiment designed to cut down on violence towards police officers and to promote a more positive public image by having the police wear things like friendlier blazers and baseball-style caps instead of traditional uniforms, was tried out in a number of American cities and abandoned as ineffective because apparently for police uniforms the traditional tougher look works. In 1985, one young black woman who's a New York City police officer recalled for a videotape made by the department here, she recalled her first days on the force, and she wondered how people would react to her. She said, "I found that to most people, I was a uniform." end quote. Most civilians perceived her simply as a police officer and not as, oh, this is a woman, not a real police officer, but just, this is a cop. And she said this was especially true of criminals who saw the blue uniform and fled. As far as they were concerned, her individual identity was totally subsumed under her professional role. Now, if we turn from men and women in blue to men and women in white, we find a somewhat different history of uniforms and sexual stereotypes. The doctor's white coat and the nurse's white cap and uniform look superficially rather similar. But as it turns out that their origins and symbolism differ considerably and are very much related to the phenomenon of sex segregation in the workplace at the hospital. So, for example, the doctor's white coat, which is now one of the main symbols of the profession, along with a stethoscope and a black bag. The doctor's white coat was a late 19th century development that originated in scientific laboratories and spread first to operating rooms and then throughout the modern hospital. That sounds reasonable. And that, in fact, is what happened. Until that time, surgeons tended to just wear an old frock coat, an ordinary man's coat, the oldest and shabbiest one in their wardrobe, which was soon stained with blood and pus after different operations. As early as 1867, the British doctor Joseph Lister reported that he'd had really good results with his patients when he washed his hands before surgery rather than after, and when he wore a clean linen apron rather than a filthy coat. And remember, they're sticking the surgical needles into the lapels of these filthy old coats, and he's going, oh, wear something clean and the patients don't die so often. Well, the other doctors just laughed at that. And it took several decades before his innovations actually started to catch on. And it was only after about 1889 that American surgeons began to wear clean white gowns or aprons for surgery. And even then, they still didn't wear face masks or surgical gloves. Now, let me turn back to the doctor for a second. The term lab coat, of course, is still popularly applied to doctors' white coats. Yet originally, laboratory coats were tan, and they only gradually changed to white as they became associated with medicine rather than scientific laboratories. There have been several interesting studies of this, and it turns out that the symbolism of the white coat seems to have been a major factor in its catching on. So, for example, in Western cultures, white clothing carries desirable connotations of life, purity, and power, especially in contrast to black, which is the color of death and mourning. And there were some very prominent and important doctors, including one Nobel laureate, Alexei Carrel, who really upset people by wearing black gowns in his operating rooms. And if any of you saw that movie about diabolical twins, they're shown in red operating gowns, and this is a very frightening symbol in the movie. Apparently, the purity of white gave patients a sense that the doctors intended them no harm. And meanwhile, white was also an attribute of superhuman power. So according to Revelations, Christ and the saints are robed in white. And since the doctor might be said to hold the power of life or death over the patient, it would be better if he looked like one of the good guys. Finally, also, white is perceived as being a color of innocence, in a sense of being asexual or virginal. And since patients must undress in front of a doctor, the white coat gives the patient a sense of protection and lessens embarrassment. So for these reasons, as well as any practical concerns, white became a symbol of medicine, even as surgeons themselves gradually shifted, because of the intense light in the operating room, to wearing operating gowns in light green or blue, because the high-intensity lighting was just too glaring on white gowns. Now, observers noted that in many ways, far from being practical, the white uniforms of physicians and interns were actually rather difficult to launder, but the symbolism was more important than the practicality. And of course, it did show that it was really white, and so it looked really germ-free, and this was important. The nurse's uniform, although also white, has a very different history and significance. Is that in focus? Not too clearly. See if you can focus it. Nurses didn't start to wear special uniform till the second half of the 19th century, with the development of nurses' training schools like the Bellevue School of Nursing, which opened in 1873. And again, the first suggestion of a uniform evoked an incredible outcry against livery. So the nursing students objected that they didn't want to wear this kind of uniform. Nevertheless, the members of the committee responsible for reforms at Bellevue insisted, quote, "A uniform, however simple, is indispensable and should be rigidly enforced. It is advantageous on the ground of economy as well as neatness, and its effect on a corps of nurses is the same as on a company of soldiers." So each hospital had its own corps of nurses whose uniforms identified them within the hierarchy of the particular school or hospital.
It took me a second to get over to the machine. I was leaning out the window.
Can you hear the talk from and back? Excuse me, guys, we can hear you out front. The principle was then established that trained nurses should wear uniforms that were simple, quiet in color, and spotlessly clean. They weren't usually white at first. Usually they were pale blue or gingham or gray, and they wore white aprons, collars, and caps. The short-sleeved, all-white, one-piece uniform, worn without a bib and apron, only came in gradually in the 1830s. This was your basic nurse's uniform initially. Now, the development of this nurse's uniform was not simply an issue of professional esprit de corps or functionalism for the job. And although later generations of nurses emphasized the hygienic virtues of wearable white, in fact, early nurses wore white aprons and caps several decades before the germ theory of disease was really applied in American medicine. 19th century photographs make it clear that nurses' uniforms were stylistically almost identical to contemporary maids' uniforms. The apron was as suited to cleaning the house or the hospital as it was to tending the sick, appropriately enough when we remember that many nurses were also expected to perform cleaning tasks at the hospital. The early caps were usually small and round with a puffed crown, and again virtually indistinguishable from many maids' caps. Later hats started to evolve, for example, tending to be folded with a turned back cuff. And this is a style which started coming in the 20s and 30s and soon became emblematic of nursing. Now, as you can tell from this picture, although the archetypal nurse was frequently described as being wearing not just a cap but a halo and being the sort of angelic figure, they were not often not treated with the kind of respect due to a trained professional. So on the one hand, they were kind of like maids, and then on the other hand, they were kind of like angels, and they seemed like sexy figures floating around the hospital. But the symbolism of their clothes was not the same as that of doctors. Today, many nurses have abandoned or modified their uniforms. Hospital dress codes have drastically changed, says Christine Shepard, who's a registered nurse and assistant director of clinical services at Lenox Hill Hospital. In the past, she said, nurses were viewed as subservient, so they were in uniform. A person in uniform has less autonomy. Today's nurses have more education and independence, she said, so we no longer dress the same. Can we get that in focus, please? It's hard for me to see on the side whether these are in focus. So you can compare with the original core of nurses and more variety now. What you sometimes find in hospitals now is that if white's been abandoned, there may be some color variation that serves as a code for people within the hospital. So different types of paramedics and different types of nurses are distinguished by uniform-like differences in the clothes. But I remember although the nurses were often very anxious to get out of their uniforms, I remember my obstetrician telling me when he first became a doctor, he wore his white coat everywhere. He was so proud of it. And he only stopped wearing it, he said, when he wore it once in a supermarket in Washington, D.C., and someone asked him where the tomatoes were. And he realized that in a different context, his white coat had a completely different meaning. Now, my sister's a doctor, and she said that from a woman's point of view in a hospital, she and many female colleagues prefer wearing some pieces of medical costume because often patients will just sort of start bossing them around as though they're candy stripers unless they can sort of have sartorial evidence that I am the doctor. And so they tend to be using it that way to reinforce their status. On the other hand, it also varies from hospital to hospital. In some places, for example in California, the young doctors feel that it's very uncool to be dressed up as a doctor and will come in just in sports jackets. So there's a lot of variation. Meanwhile, different kinds of workers have often worn different uniforms. Now, craft workers, skilled craft workers, were often associated with particular uniforms. So, for centuries, bakers have had their uniform, painters have had their uniform, etc. With factory workers, though, uniforms only started coming in slowly in the late 19th century. And again, America seems to have been one of the leading countries. So, for example, as one English observer pointed out in 1912, quote, "A mechanic in the United States does not go to and from work in an oil-stained dungarees. He changes his clothes at the factory." And this was something that was a novelty. One thing which was a factor, of course, is who is going to pay for the uniform. Is it going to be the factory or is it going to be the individual worker? Now, as you can see from this picture, even working within factories, heavy industry tended to be a male preserve, whereas women tended to be shunted towards light industries. Women often worked under male supervisors, and as we can see here from this picture, which is a photograph of a silk mill in Paterson, New Jersey in 1914, the female textile workers wore long skirts and sometimes aprons. It's not a specialized work uniform, although they're making an effort to protect their clothes with things like the aprons. The male supervisor in the back wears a professional business suit, and in a demonstration of his attitude of superiority towards the female workers, he's taken off his coat jacket. That would not be a polite thing to do. So by doing that, he's indicating that he feels that he's better than they are, and he doesn't have to follow the regular proprieties of how you behave around women. During World War I, more women started working in factories, and the beginnings of factory uniforms for women, including pants uniforms, started to come in. Now, this was controversial. A lot of articles at the time said, should women be wearing these pants? Is it really true that it's dangerous for them to be wearing skirts? Couldn't they just sort of tie their hair back or something? This photograph, which is from the American Machinist in 1918, shows a typical World War I uniform, a boiler suit and cap, which was developed by a committee of women workers who got together to decide what they felt would be the safest and most functional uniform for their particular kind of factory. A one-woman munitions worker was quoted at the time as saying, "I should hate to have to go back to work in the old long skirts." So a number of people did feel liberated by these clothes that they could wear at work. Also, it was more possible to wear pants at work than it was on the street. So many of the taboos against women in pants didn't hold if they were wearing gym pants in a college gymnasium or a boiler suit at a factory which was mostly manned by women workers. They didn't have to worry about the problems that they would face wearing trousers out on the street. Now, during World War II, again, a number of women went into heavy industries, including war industries, to free men to go off to fight. And women's work experience encompassed both regular light industry and the kind of Rosie the Riveter heavy industrial jobs. And again, for this type of job, they often wore bifurcated uniforms. And some companies increasingly began to provide uniforms. As one article put it, the uniforms might not enhance a girl's charms, but they were good garments for fighting on the production front. Here's another picture from the 1940s. Incidentally, what you often find in these pictures is although women are wearing clothes which are designed to be functional, you also often see them wearing fairly elaborate hairstyles and heavy makeup to emphasize that they are still women. Now, again, as women were breaking into office work, initially the goal was to have them look a little bit like men, certainly like very respectable middle-class women. Because as women started flooding into office work, the men started flooding out to get better jobs. Before the Civil War, men who were clerks fully expected that if they worked hard and were smart, they could own their own business. As the era of high capitalism developed and businesses became bigger, increasingly the labor force was proletarianized and feminized. So the new female secretaries who came in couldn't expect to become captains of industry the way the earlier clerks and scriveners had hoped to be. So whereas the earlier men had dressed like their boss and hoped to replace him or start their own business, now there's a new style developing which is respectable but subordinate. After all, office work might not have paid very much, but at least it was clean, safe, and respectable. And all of these were considerations for women entering the workforce. There was as yet no distinction between female executives and female secretaries. All female office workers tended to be subordinates, with a handful of exceptions of women who started their own companies. This is a suit from 1918, and again in the literature from the early 20th century keeps insisting the correct business attire for the modern woman suggests the best tailoring worn by men with just the touch of femininity which will save the woman from a certain hardness and harshness. So the author also of The Efficient Secretary, 1916, warned against both ultra-feminine and ultra-masculine dress. She wrote, "Women are apt to wear fluffy, frilly, chiffon-like garments and unnecessary furbelows, or they're apt to fly to the other extreme and dress in tweeds cut on masculine lines. The first extreme, the frilly one, is never in good taste and never permissible for business wear. The second is permissible, to be sure, but unbecoming, except when worn by a woman who is dainty, girlish, and very feminine." Now, notice the beginning of a change of emphasis. Whereas the late Victorians wanted people to look very serious, responsible, asexual, increasingly in the early 20th century, there's the beginning of a shift in emphasis, and attractiveness starts to become a more and more desirable attribute in women working at the office. This picture here, of course, is from a Vogue. It's a Vogue ad for Helene Braziers. And it associates the woman's clothes with her image as a sexy subordinate. The businessman portrayed is older and physically rather unattractive, but he's clearly in control. This is his business. His suit functions as a badge of status and authority, and her clothing puts her in the position of a kind of office sex object as much as a subordinate or a colleague. Now, increasingly, in the 30s and 40s, secretaries were valued for their decorative effect, almost like office mistresses or office wives. So as one job advertisement put it in 1931, quote, "An exceptionally attractive, intelligent young woman, not over 25, must be educated and well-bred, with charming personality, a natural blonde, 5 feet 8 inches tall and slender, a smart wardrobe necessary." And the person is advertising for a particular image. Now, it's not so much that he expected to sleep with her, but she was supposed to be a kind of surrogate wife or mistress for the office. Many secretaries were expected to work for a few years before getting married. And in movies and novels and magazine articles, there's this emphasis on marrying the boss. And in the literature for working women at the time, you get all of this advice that a man chooses his secretary much as he chooses his wife, and for much the same reasons. She looks good to him. And in many ways, a good secretary was supposed to be like a good wife. She was supposed to be attractive, loyal, self-effacing, with an even disposition, a good personality, performing her work efficiently. Ideally, she should be unmarried, but display wifely tendencies, since in many ways her personality and social role were those of a kind of office sweetheart or wife. Like the wife or sweetheart, the secretary was supposed to think with her employer, think for her employer, think of her employer. So no wonder he didn't want to promote her. By the 1970s, many women's magazines had taken a different tack. As women started for the first time entering executive roles in large numbers, so-called power dressing began to be described as combat gear for the trip to the top. Now, we already find in the 50s and 60s some writing emphasizing that if you want to be taken seriously at the office and dress as someone who wants to make a career your life work, you should be wearing a suit to separate you from the secretaries who would be wearing sweaters and dresses. So you have already found that material for a couple of decades. But now, increasingly, this kind of advice to dress to go for the top is found across the board. Pants, of course, become temporarily popular for work, but many women found that colleagues and clients still regarded trousers as too masculine and or too informal. And gradually, as the unconventionality of the late 60s and early 70s evolved, the pantsuits was quickly replaced by a suit with a skirt. Some of you may have read articles or books by the art and fashion historian Anne Hollander. She pointed out that a tailored suit with a skirt creates an image that combines the image of the practical, business-like uniformity of the man's suit with what she calls a bland statement of female gender. So the skirt says in a kind of polite, unthreatening way, I am a businesswoman, not an imitation man. But while we're working together, please treat me simply as a colleague. Okay, so it says, yes, woman, I'm not threatening you, but let's just have it as a collegial relationship. Only underlings wear provocative clothes, argues the guru of dress for success, John Malloy, who has repeatedly insisted that suits are associated with power. Suits are absolutely essential. The next one. Can we get the next slide? It's not moving forward. Much of the literature about women's dressing for work in the 70s and the 80s had emphasized all of the sexual no-nos that were involved. Clothing that is too sexy, light, or low cut is inappropriate. It says everything from Mademoiselle to the New York Times. We can hear, okay? Low-cut blouses in particular, or diaphanous blouses, were unacceptable. Anything short, tight, or too long, long skirts were also unacceptable. Indeed, anything associated with feminine seductiveness was and remains taboo. So also long, loose hair or elaborate hairstyles, ruffles, cute clothing, extreme makeup, dangling jewelry, all of these were labeled as unacceptable. Mademoiselle said, quote, "There's something about really high heels in the office that makes a woman look dumb or like a floozy." This one's not going forward either. On the other hand, the standard advice also insisted that you shouldn't go severity mad, like an imitation man. So that although women were increasingly accepted as part of the workforce, except in certain industries like advertising, where extreme looks were popular, a very, very mannish look was discouraged. Now, we have seen an increasing emphasis on distinctions between women executives and secretaries. And this, in fact, becomes a main theme in the 80s. Can we get the next one? So, for example, as the suit starts to spread, more and more distinctions need to be brought in to emphasize that, in fact, you're not a secretary or beginning worker, but that you're somehow someone very important at that office. And by the mid-1980s, a number of women who had broken into high levels in business started moving away from the more clone-like dress for success look. Some people have suggested that male hires up really didn't, senior executives disliked women's navy blue or gray suits. Professional women themselves may also have become bored with the uniform because women have been brought up in a less uniform mode. It emerged that dressing like men may not be the best way to reach the top. So by 1985, the New York Times carried a front-page article entitled, "Women Dressing to Succeed Think Twice About the Suit," which opened with contrasting opinions. John Malloy insisting the skirted suit should become the uniform for almost all business situations, and then the author of Executive Style, Mary Fedoruk, writing, "We've brainwashed ourselves into thinking that executive wear is synonymous with a suit." So Malloy kept insisting the suit is not dead, although he admitted that women executives could occasionally wear, quote, "wear something equally dark, conservative, and asexual," end quote. But he warned that if a woman abandoned power dressing entirely in favor of what he referred to as frivolous Vogue fashions, then, quote, "everyone will know she's fluffing out." So although a softer look was supposed to be acceptable, again, it had to be within very narrow parameters. Also, of course, one problem was that no matter how women dressed, it is impossible to control entirely how other people are going to perceive you. There was a headline in the Wall Street Journal in 1984 called "Viva la différence, in business world, quelle différence?" Women are told to emulate men and shun provocations such as open-toed shoes. And they talked about not just open-toed shoes, but shoes where the toe cleavage was 1/16 of an inch more than it would be in a normal pump. So you could see 1/16 of an inch of the crack between the toes. Now I'd suggest that if people are looking at women's feet and talking about the crack between the toes as toe cleavage and saying, there you are, you're dressed very correctly in a business suit and your feet are just screaming sex, that this may have more to do with how people are viewing women than anything really risque about the clothes themselves. That women can expect to have a number of men viewing them as sexual objects, no matter what very kind of conservative clothes they're trying to wear. Now, the opposite is seldom true. So, for example, although we do have a recent tendency in these Corbin ads to emphasize that women would also find an attractive man's suit sexy, this has not been a major theme in the literature on men's business clothing. Although it was very interesting in the movie American Gigolo how many scenes were devoted to him shopping for Armani clothes and opening his closet and taking out suits by Armani and laying them out on the bed for trips which never materialized. I mean, it was not a necessary plot device. It was just an excuse to show you his Armani suits. There has been a little bit of research which indicates that, at least for middle and upper middle class women, the image of a man in an expensive, well-tailored business suit does make the man appear more, quote, potent than a man who's more casually dressed. This is not because men's business suits work on the principle that they're more body revealing or seductive or in the way that women's clothes can be, but rather, more as Henry Kissinger put it, for when women regard power as an aphrodisiac, then if men are wearing something which makes them look rich and powerful, women will be more attracted to them. And so in that sense, very good men's tailoring can be attractive to women. But it all, again, varies according to the circumstances. Some women would die for an Armani suit, but would treat Brooks Brothers as being uptight and bourgeois, or J.C. Penney being beyond the pale, whatever. It's very much a fluctuating situation. But this potency effect, the sexiness effect, does not seem to work for women. In other words, women are not regarded as more sexually attractive because of wearing expensive suits. Nowadays, despite the ubiquity of the business suit, we find that the totally mannish look for women is still taboo. This is a 1985 advertisement showing that there's still significant differences between the way men and women dress for work, so that although professional women tend to wear a business suit which is closely modeled on a man's business suit, they wear a skirt, not trousers. It tends to be a softer suit. The tie in particular and the shirt tend to be different. You wear pumps instead of flat shoes, etc. Now, the type of neckwear in particular apparently influences people's perceptions of working women, and there's been some interesting research on this. So, for example, particularly for women lawyers, for whom image is very, very important because your client's freedom or life may be at stake, depending on the jury's perception of you as well as your client. They did a study seeing which kinds of neckwear affected the jury's perceptions of a woman lawyer's authority. They found that a man's type necktie was not well received, nor was a crisp bow tie of the sort which used to be much worn by professional women. The researchers also found that an unfavorably masculine impression was created by the crispness of this type of bow tie. On the other hand, an ascot was regarded as too arty, and you don't want to be defended by an arty-looking lawyer. The best tie was a kind of long, narrow scarf, which was sort of similar to a man's tie, but with a softness that identified the scarf as belonging to a woman. And then the second most positive response came from a floppy bow tie. there's obviously more than phallic symbolism at work here, but it does seem suggestive that women's ties needed to be seen as softer to be acceptably feminine. Now, as we've seen, it's very hard on women lawyers. This profession is one where clothing rules tend to be much stricter than in many other professions. Lawyers consciously have to dress to meet the expectations of judge and jury. And as one Washington, D.C. resident put it, I might hire someone in a cord suit to defend me on a traffic violation, but to defend my freedom or my life, I want someone who wears a dark suit, who can command a courtroom. The problem also is that some of the aggressiveness, which we traditionally associate with a good, powerful lawyer, conflicts with the stereotype that women should be gentle and nice, so that an aggressive male lawyer may be seen as effectively dominating the courtroom, but an aggressive female lawyer may be dismissed as sort of bitchy. So this is a problem as well as the clothing. Women lawyers in the last few years have tended, when asked about this, to suggest that it's better to wear a suit, definitely with a skirt, never pants. The right dress might work in the office, but the courtroom is not the place to break with tradition. By '87, some women lawyers were reporting that the suit was less important as long as they wear something that was equally polished and professional looking. And they also felt that by wearing things like understated jewelry and discreet makeup, this increased their authority by adding polish. And you find this also in some literature for business women. Also, high heels were advisable. But again, it depends partly on the particular area, the particular jury. Sometimes you can dress to tailor, sorry, no pun intended, your approach to that particular jury. So one male lawyer described, wearing cowboy boots into the courtroom when he felt that this would appeal to the jury. But that type of play acting has to be taken with a certain amount of care. Here we find this woman is saying, of course, you have to deal with the kind of prejudices that you face. One woman reported that in the 70s, when she was wearing a fairly casual skirt and top into the courtroom, the judge accosted her shouting, "Madam, are you a lawyer?" because she was dressed so inappropriately. And she said nowadays, whether things have changed or just because everyone at the courtrooms knows who she is, she says, the more experienced I get, the more irrelevant my clothes become. Either I'm more known or it no longer matters. And in fact, studies that have been done on women in the office also indicate that it seems to be more important and more effective to wear the more stereotyped clothes when you're at the beginning of your career. And the higher you go up in the hierarchy at your office, and the better known you are within your field, the less it matters what you wear, and the more you can simply dispense with these rules. As we've seen, as the whole dress for success look became a cliche, and the executive woman's man-tailored suit became a very widespread fashion, it was increasingly satirized. And this is from the Girl's Guide to Executive Success, 1984, which suggests that the skirted suit and briefcase were once the woman executive's unquestioned badge of authority. These days, she might find herself surrounded by imposters. This is a wonderful book, which also spoofs the whole idea of how long should your skirt be at the office, and it says you should take as your guide, when in doubt, let a Catholic school dress code be your guide. Skirts should hit the floor when kneeling, although you should never kneel under any circumstances. Nowadays, the search seems to go on for some kind of a female alternative to a man's business suit, in part because so many women have expressed boredom or discomfort with wearing what they regard as a man-tailored uniform all the time. Donna Karan has been relatively successful in emphasizing what she describes as more womanly types of clothing. It's not man-tailored clothing. It is very rich, looking clothing, so it promotes a successful look, which is an important part of men's business dress. But again, the whole draping and so on come out of a women's dressmaking tradition, out of Chanel's jersey suits, etc., rather than a man's tailored tradition. And then another approach has been taken by people like Giorgio Armani, who've been moved over the last 10 or 15 years to increasingly soften both men's and women's traditional tailoring. And Armani more and more strikes me as being very much like the Chanel of this period, because he creates what looks like a very, very simple, unstructured, comfortable garment, but it takes a great deal of complex artistry to take out the construction in a jacket. So it may be that in some sense there's a moving together of male and female styles, where women are accepting a much greater degree of uniformity than has been historically typical. They're following the male model of uniformity, but at the same time loosening both the structure of the uniform and the absolute rigid rules of uniform dress, which have been associated with men in the business world. Thank you very much. If we can have the lights, but not that one in front of me, I'll answer questions. Any questions? Yeah? I think her impact was fairly substantial, as was Marlene Dietrich's, because they created images which were seen by millions of people of women in pants and having this look both attractive and also businesslike. Pants for women have a really checkered history. The whole idea of women in bifurcated garments just was totally taboo for centuries in the West. Pants were the main symbol of masculinity and masculine power. So you get, in the 19th century, dress reform tracts which insist pants equal power. Women must wear pants if they're to achieve power. Not just for practical reasons, but symbolically. It seemed symbolic of the energy and movement. Was very, very difficult and slow process before women could wear pants. In the 20s, they could wear them for parties and for lounging pajamas and for horseback riding or bicycling, but still not so much on the street. And increasingly it would move out. You could wear a little bit more. You could wear pants for gardening. You could wear pants in the country. But even as late as the 1970s, it was still really shocking to wear trousers a lot in town and to wear trousers to work. And so I think anytime someone like Katharine Hepburn set a precedent for women wearing trousers, it was very important, even though it might take a while before that spread. But in the 50s and even the early 60s, yes, people did wear trousers in the city, but it was kind of a bit odd, more something that teenagers would do or beatniks would do. It took quite until the 70s before a lot of women were wearing trousers to work.
You talked about nurses before. Nurses do work, and it was in the early 1900s. How, if they were so heavily corseted, were they heavily corseted? If they were doing work, how could they bend down when there was all the fortunes they had to wear down?
Everybody but the very, very poorest vagrants wore corsets in the 19th century. Almost all women wore corsets. However, in most cases, the corsets were not laced particularly tightly, and so bending down in them was no more of a problem than bending down in a kind of girdle type thing today. I've looked at hundreds of corsets in corset collections and museum collections, because this was a big part of my first book on fashion and eroticism. And most corsets we wouldn't have any problem fitting in today. Mostly they're padded on top and over the hips. So they're not really usually squeezed in anywhere near as tight as we might be led to believe by Gone with the Wind. The smallest one I've ever seen would lace to 18 inches completely closed. And even when you're talking about 18-inch or 19-inch corset, they usually weren't laced completely closed. You might have 1, 2, 3, 4 inches where the laces were open and back. Also, the degree of boning varied a lot. So many working class women might wear something that would have fewer bones, or even bone substitutes like cording, which again would be more flexible. It was something that women wore and didn't really, for the most part, think that much of, because standard medical opinion at the time indicated that women's bodies were so weak that they needed some kind of support. In fact, men sometimes wore corsets in the 19th century too for exercise, like for horseback riding, and military men would wear corsets for horseback riding because they thought that their bodies were stronger, but still, under the jarring of riding the horse, they needed more body support. I'm working on a book with a medical doctor, Dr. Lynn Cucci down south, and she's been going through lots of medical records, autopsy records, etc. She cannot find any evidence that this ever occurred, and she feels it's highly unlikely because with the standard of medical practice at the time, you would have died. So I think she said that such an operation seems to have been impossible, and perhaps was a fantasy or a fear rather than a reality of the time. Yes?
I wonder if you could comment on Mrs. Thacker and how her dress affects her appearance.
It's very interesting because you see in the last couple of years in particular how she's trying to use clothing to soften the Iron Maiden look and to try and look more fashionable, more feminine. You can see it with her hairstyle as well as the fashion. Whereas earlier in her career, she seems to have been emphasizing more, not exactly a unisex look, but a more sort of straightforward, professional, don't think of me as a woman, think of me as a professional look. And now she seems to be emphasizing this more womanly look. I don't know if this is because she's already reached a position of authority, or because as she becomes more unpopular, she's trying to appeal by emphasizing sort of womanly, softer qualities. But I think it will be interesting to see her styles laid out year after year, to see this trend away from a more orthodox business suit to this more womanly style.
Doesn't she carry a real appearance of power?
Yes, she does. In Britain, it's somewhat different than in America also, though, because the British, as a rule, tend to look down on fashion as something that's more frivolous and time-wasting than Americans do. So it's a slightly different emphasis. She'd want more of an unchanging classic look than an American woman politician might feel would be politic to adopt. Yeah?
I have two questions that are sort of related about the differences between men's and women's fashions. It seems to me that men, over the years, their fashions have stayed pretty much the same, the suit, the traditional suit, and women's fashions have changed much more, as well as women's fashions seem to have more color in them. I'm wondering if that could be related to the search that women have to find something that will make them legitimate in their workplace.
One thing I think that you see with men's clothes is the whole trend towards uniformity comes in much earlier and more clearly for men. Not just with the development of the suit from the three-piece and now mostly a two-piece suit, but also the whole idea that government officials were put in uniform. Kings would put their bureaucrats in uniform. You'd have military men in uniform. So men were very much used to a more restricted sense of fashion expression. In a sense, women's clothing has stayed similar too, in as much as it still mostly consists of a skirt and a top or a dress form. But the actual shape of that dress has changed a lot more, gotten dramatically shorter, and pants have been brought in and so on. And I think you may very well be right that this expresses ambivalence about women's changing role, or kind of search for which look approximates the role more. But also it may just be that women have for a long time stayed closer to the old pre-modern approach. Because after all, until the late 18th and early 19th century, men's clothes were just as elaborate, fashionable, changing as women's clothes. They were more flamboyant, more modish. It's only as capitalism really began to get underway that men's clothes settled into a fairly uniform mode. And much more slowly, as women left the family circle and went out and took part in the public world, they followed men. So basically 200 years after men sort of developed the uniform for work, women were following in that same direction. The question is whether it should be really necessary to model it so much on a male uniform. But something that creates that same business-like, slightly anonymous impression seems to be regarded as useful in the business world. So some equivalent, anyway, of a man's suit. Any?
No, this is really the subject of another lecture, but I wondered, since you mentioned this area of body dressing, I wondered if you could comment on what makes for successful body dressing.
Oh, these sort of all the things you should avoid at the office. Well, there's a wonderful expression in the underwear industry where lingerie is referred to as intimate body fashions. And all clothes are body fashions in as much as that's where you wear them. You don't hang them on the wall. And they do say things about your body. They're sexy because they refer to your body. The clothes which most people find sexiest are those which refer most to the naked body underneath or to intimate associations of disrobing and making love. So lingerie is widely regarded as very sexy because it's right next to your body, it sort of glides over your body or it hugs your body, and it acquires a sexual charm from your body and then adds the sort of additional frisson of its own. So any clothes which seem to make a reference to your body or to intimacy, bedrooms, sexual intercourse, those kinds of clothes seem to be regarded as very sexy. Also, certain kinds of women's clothes like high heel shoes and garter belts acquire I hate to call it a fetishistic appeal, but an appeal even apart from the body, so that a high-heeled shoe, people will see it and they'll go, oh, that's such a sexy shoe. Again, I think it's not something as simple as just, a phallic foot slipping into a vaginal shoe or this high heel. It's not just fetishistic, because it appeals to women too, and fetishists are almost all men. But things like high heel shoes seem to strike large numbers of men and women as being very, very sexy. There are many fewer men's clothes that people reach such a degree of unanimity about. Men's underwear, people, neither men nor women, tend to find very sexy, even though you've had very brief, colored, silky men's underwear around since the 1930s, but not many people have responded to it as enthusiastically as they respond to women's lingerie. On the other hand, when Calvin Klein and all brought in those gender bender, men's style athletic underwear for women, all of a sudden everyone said, oh, this is the sexiest thing since the bikini. Somehow, when women wore man-style underwear, it was sexier, but no one had thought it was very sexy when the men were wearing it. It's very odd. It has to do, I think, with people tending more to think of women in sexual terms, whereas men tend to be rather reluctant sexual objects. They want to look sexually attractive to other people, but they're afraid that it people would perceive them as being effeminate, which is partly a code word for homosexual. There's a lot of homophobia, which keeps men from wanting to look overtly sexually attractive. Sorry. Yeah. Earlier on, there are not very many maternity clothes extant because women tended to stay at home, so they'd wear at-home Mother Hubbards, loose clothes, tea gowns and things, rather than specialty clothes. And now it's really shocking that it's so hard to find maternity clothes. It just seems to be a specialty where the industry feels that they're not going to buy very many of them, so why should we bother to give them a big choice? It's partly similar to the kind of problems that women who are heavier face. If you're a woman who's, a size 16 or over, forget it. You're offered a very small selection, even though there are lots and lots of heavy women in America. But the industry, people don't seem to feel they'd be buying that many clothes.
I just want to say that there are specialty shops for maternity clothes for business.
Yeah, like suits. And in fact, there was an article in the Washington Post that was interesting about that, saying, pregnancy is the one thing that only women can do, so it seems even stranger that when you're pregnant, you should be wearing very man-styled uniform clothes to the office. A lot of women felt that the business suit basically was men's clothing, just adapted to women, and felt this sort of lack of congruence between being pregnant and wearing what they regarded as a man-tailored suit. Like this seemed to show some ambivalence about whether women should be at the office or something. Anything else? It's getting late. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.